You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode where no BUBS has gone before. My name's Jay Reckward, here with my co-host Jake Reckward, also my father. Here on a podcast exploring the show Star Trek The Next Generation, its themes, characters, and storylines as we record our thoughts and feelings about them in posterity for Jake's grandson and my son, Ben. But we're also recording these and releasing them on YouTube for the enjoyment of the general audience. How are you doing today, Jake?
I'm good, Jay. Thank you.
We're looking tonight at Star Trek The Next Generation, Season 1, Episode 8, Justice, which aired on November 9th, 1987. I think there's a lot of really interesting things to talk about when it comes to this episode, and thank you for sending me some notes along ahead of time so we can kind of structure this conversation a little bit more.
Right.
Before we get started, did you enjoy the episode, and what did you think of it in general?
Well, yeah, I liked it because it was very nice to see the young blonde, scantily clad women running around and so forth. It was like, where did this come from? But so on the surface, it was entertaining. It was different, but once I watched it the second time, it has a lot of heavy ideas in it.
Mm-hmm. I was kind of surprised by the episode in terms of the previous two episodes. I thought were really good in terms of the stories they told and kind of the internal logic of the stories themselves.
Mm-hmm.
As you pointed out, and we'll get to there's some kind of illogical inconsistencies in terms of the storytelling in this episode, particularly when it comes to the Prime Directive and Picard's behavior towards the Prime Directive. But I enjoy this episode because it starts on a very different tone and quickly shifts into something else.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, it becomes a heavy conversation that carries a lot of difficult and potentially explosive subjects along with it. Some of them pertaining to the conversations we had the last episode about the future of religious movements here in America.
Right. Yeah.
So to get started, let's kind of get the audience up to snuff with where we are in the episode. So the crew of the Enterprise has delivered a party of Earth colonists to the Strand solar system on a Class M planet. And along the way back, they have discovered another Class M planet in the adjoining Rubicon star system called Rubicon 3. I think it's called Rubicon 3. Is that correct?
I don't remember exact name. Yeah.
Here. I also have Rubicon 3.
Okay.
So on Rubicon 3, there's the society known as the Edo that are a human-like civilization that doesn't seem to have any sort of work capability, but they live in kind of this paradise society that very much mimics the Garden of Eden, where everyone basically is ultra lawful, a little bit puritanical, but they're ultra welcoming, and they seem to, as Geordi LaForge notes very early on in the episode, make love at the drop of a hat.
Yes.
The early part of the episode is really built around the idea of the crew convincing Captain Jean-Luc Picard to allow them all shore leave down on this planet of Rubicon 3 among the Edo. With I had to note like a lot of the crew members seemed really eager to. I think they all understood that there was a sexual connotation to what would happen as soon as they got down on the planet, especially Riker, who's already been down on the planet and knows how these people act. Who
Right.
and they act in a very not an aggressive way, but a very forward way in terms of as Troy will later note upon meeting them the second time, a healthy sensuality and happiness,
Hmm.
even among meeting new strangers. So I think there's kind of this really humorous scene where they're trying to like get around the idea that like it's not only we need to get people out in the fresh air, but we also want to have this kind of not lurid or illicit, but this kind of sexual recreation that we may not be able to have because Riker keeps talking. Riker and Geordi are very open about like how welcoming these people are and how beautiful this place is, and even when they get down, like what the second Edo, her name is Ravan. Ravan is very forward towards Worf, who reciprocates, um,
Hmm.
pleasantly, but we're getting ahead a little bit. So the crew beams down and they meet these Edo who tell them they're, of course, welcome to bring the entire crew down for shore leave and enjoy the fruits of their society. And I have to say, in your notes, you noted that there was we're going to be having a lot of conversations about perceptions of God and the general perception of God, and maybe our own evolving uh, perceptions of God as it pertains to you and I.
Hmm.
But one thing that I noted about the Edo and Rubicon 3 in general, and it's because I'm working on a urban fantasy novel right now that has a heavily biblical influence to it. The Edo is very much a Garden of Eden like setting.
It is, yes.
And that's
Hmm.
important to note because after they go down, Picard, while remaining with Data and Geordi up on the bridge of the Enterprise, have noticed that something that has previously been perceived as a sensor glitch is actually the shadow of an object waiting off their. I think it was
It seems to be in orbit with the Enterprise in,
yes over Rubicon 3.
yes.
It's in orbit over Enterprise, but like uh, Geordi is able to go to the observation lounge and actually get sight of
Use his
and use
vision
his
that looks at,
visor
yes, exactly.
to get a multispectral analysis of this object that, as you've noted, is floating in orbit along with the Enterprise above Rubicon 3. We are quickly introduced to the fact that this thing is um, basically the Edo's god god form, if that makes any sense. They explain that the Edo explained that at one point in their society, they lived a very chaotic existence in their civilization where they lied, cheated, stealed, and murdered. Basically, barbarism and chaos before the coming of the light. And then after the arrival of this god figure, uh, they after the arrival of this god figure, they have now been allowed to develop into this paradise-like society that they have, but with some very stringent laws in terms of behavior, especially when it comes to like it seems like there's a very dedicated premium on like property and gardens and maybe the structure of things.
Yeah, we really don't know the complete set of laws that they have, but what you'll share with the audience is that it ends up that they're very strict. That if you break the law, you die.
Well, let's get to the moment where the law is actually broken. So one person Picard sends down with the rest of the crew on the away team is Wesley Crusher,
The boy.
a boy, to see if the planet is hospitable for the younger members of the Enterprise passengers. Because we have to remember there are thousands of people on board. And even Ravan, later on, when Picard brings her on board, kind of notes, and I think it's important to note, because we're going to be talking about this god being of the Edo here in a second, or this god craft. Um, she notes that, you live in a city.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's very important to note when we start talking about this godcraft thing that kind of controls the Edo and protects them in a way, shepherds them. Um, so Wesley, while playing with the children, with the other Edo children, accidentally strays into an area that during the day, at some point, if it falls into the purview of the mediators, anyone in that zone is liable to be at risk for death. Wesley accidentally strays into one of these zones while playing ball with the other children and accidentally falls into one of the garden beds. Immediately, two of the Edo's security teams, which are denoted by their scantily gray uniforms, arrives to inform him that because of his acts, he will be put to death. And we really reach the main conflict here of on the ground, the crew of the Enterprise with Riker, dealing with the law of the Edo as it comes to Wesley Crusher's life, while kind of the secondary story up above on the Enterprise is Picard dealing with this god figure of the Edo, who kind of ensures and protects this society's existence. So let's get into the being's self-perception of God. I was wondering what you really thought of the God. Uh, there's actually a term for it here at Memory Alpha. Oh, the Edo God, just the Edo God. They call it the Edo God. What are your thoughts about the Edo God?
Um, I think the way that you described the Edo people and society, one thing that's interesting that I didn't pick up that you mentioned is a question that maybe we don't need to address because we won't know the answer to it is they seem to be a pre-warp society. So why did the Enterprise even go down onto this planet?
Yes.
That aside, the Edo described themselves as being in the past very barbaric and lying and cheating and stealing, etc., murdering. And it seemed like what happened is this again, one of the things we've seen in some of the episodes that we're dealing with, trans-dimensional beings. And one of the things about this Edo god was a question. Troy got involved with this. Was it a single entity or was it multiple entities?
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out again, just like the energy cloud
Mm-hmm.
that Picard became part of, was absorbed into, and then escaped from in the last episode, this Edo god entity is, as Jordy described it, and as one of the sensor technicians described it, it's half there.
Mm-hmm.
And they decide that, what they surmise is that it's partially in the Enterprise dimension, our dimension, and it's partly somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the notes I made is this kind of an ancient alien story in that this Edo god, this transdimensional group of entities, that they came up on the planet and saw the chaos, and they actually, presented themselves somehow as God, because there's a big voice that comes out of the sky when the Enterprise people were down on the planet and so forth. And actually, there's this probe that comes from the Edo god onto the bridge of the Enterprise, and it sort of mates with data and does a knowledge download from data. So did this Edo god show up at some point and project itself into Edo society and set the rules so that they wouldn't have the chaos, and treats them very much as not so much pets, but as truly as children in a sense,
Well,
but
the
but
yes.
but sets up these very strict rules that there's these areas that you cannot enter, and they move around from day to day and so forth, and they're marked by these white fences, and you can't go into it. And if you go into it, the penalty is death. So there's very strict regimen put on the behavior of the Edo people by this godlike uh, entity.
And despite that, if you would look at the Edo, you would not think that they were living under any. What you describe sounds like a very oppressive environment, but if you look at what the Edo are living with down on their planet, like I've said earlier, it's alluded to be a very Eden-like atmosphere. They're all fit and beautiful and wonderful and blonde and blue-eyed and running around in scantily clad uniforms among this paradise-like setting with it does there were even a few people among them that were elderly. And yeah, I
I
didn't
didn't
notice.
notice that. I didn't
You
notice that.
don't notice it, but like there were a few elderly women actually
Huh.
among the Edo. I didn't actually see any elder men except for
Huh.
the guards. The guards were, I thought, a little bit older than the
They were.
rest.
That's right. Yes.
But you know, it doesn't seem like they're facing any ill health or disease or any sort of outward threat in their environment. Um,
It's total acceptance of this godlike entity.
well, it really makes me think of how much people put into religion and spirituality simply to find a sense of order to the universe
Oh, yes.
out of the chaos, and how quickly some will assume every aspect and edict of a belief, be it in a set of philosophies or in a sentient object like the Edo god. They will quickly grab onto that if it offers them a way out of the misery they experience on a daily basis.
Well, and that's a good point because one of the things that happens, and we'll probably talk more about this, is that, as you alluded, is that Picard is sort of in a strange situation here because he respects the Edo law as following the prime directive, even though, as I just said, he's kind of broken it because they're a pre-warp society. But he is not going. He's not. He has this responsibility for the safety of his crew members. In this case, Wesley Crusher, and he decides that he's not going to let them execute Wesley Crusher for, an action that, in terms of Federation law and Terran customs, is something that shouldn't be punishable by death. So after the God entity has here's the discussion from Picard, and this gets into something we'll talk about, the moral relativism. The God entity sort of lets Wesley and the Enterprise crew go.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what message did that send to the Edo? Because they had this idea that their laws absolutely had to be obeyed.
So
So they were left with a situation where the God let these aliens off the hook. So we don't know the end of the story. Is the next day did they sit down and say to one another, "What the hell happened here?"
this is where I noted earlier on when we started recording that this is an episode that I thought had a lot of illogical inconsistencies. From the crew actually, you know, let's tackle some of these bit by bit. Okay, so when we open up the episode, Riker and some of the away team, at least Riker and Yar, are already down on the surface of the planet. So we have to assume like they came upon this planet and they scanned the planet like they always do, and they determined there was a pre-warp civilization there. So okay, maybe Picard was like, well, okay, beam down and like go take a look at them and tell us what you think, but don't interact with them because Prime Directive. But maybe they went down there and somehow they accidentally got caught, and the Prime Direct. Well, these people know we're here now, so we might as well interact with them. It'd be wrong for us to just act like we're not here. But none of that's set up, so
Right.
how we're here doesn't make sense.
Hmm.
Um, at the same time, there's also, and it's kind of addressed a little bit by Picard when he's dealing with the Edo God. They've already come into this star system, and they've basically colonized a nearby planet. But somehow they didn't. Somehow, in the process of like scanning for other M class worlds, this nearby M class world wasn't picked up in terms of its pre-warp civilization by whatever survey craft was initially picking out planets for the Federation to possibly colonize.
Which is really another inconsistency.
Yeah, a huge one. Um, so, but if we put those to the side, I think one thing that kind of stands out to me is how, and how kind of lopsided the show is. Because on one hand, like we start in media res, which is a literary and storytelling term for starting in the midst of the action.
Hmm.
We start in media res, but the problem with the episode is that really we kind of end in media res without any resolution. Every story needs a resolution, and like you've noted, there's really no resolution with the Edo. It's kind of just wrapped up at the very end with the Edo god allowing the crew to beam away with Wesley Crusher. But I think that there may be reasons to that we can pick on in terms of the other parts of the notes you sent. For example, protective of the children. There's a storyline here about Picard and Beverly Crusher being protective of Wesley as their son and child, with Picard even alluding to several times that he sees Wesley a little bit as his son already.
Yes.
But the Edo god refers to the Edo down on the planet as his children, or their. I'm going to say his. I know that we've said that there's probably multiple entities aboard this. I think it's a craft. Between you and me, I think it's a multi-dimensional craft that is
Oh,
somehow
oh,
able to
oh,
sit on the edge between dimensions.
oh, I totally agree. I mean, obviously, the ship that the Enterprise sees, there's visually in what Geordi sees with his visor, it is a craft. So
Oh
that
yeah.
they're the entities, even though that they're in some trans-dimensional state, they're definitely beings on a ship. Yes, right.
Do you know what would be a real son of a bitch?
What's that?
You get up there, you get onto that ship one day, and it's just been other humans the other time, and they're just stuffy alien assholes.
Right.
um, I think the question, and it's kind of getting back to the ancient alien thing. I think there's always been an attempt in science fiction to kind of conjecture at the origin of humanity. And I think here this is kind of an associate story being told with the Edo, where there's a biblical story being told that I've alluded to previously with the Garden of Eden, where, biblically there's a very stringent set of rules being
Mm-hmm.
held in place by God for Adam and Eve, which really break down to, don't leave the garden, which you can't because there's a wall of briars around it and an angel guarding the gate with a sword of fire. And then don't eat from these two trees in the garden. Well, don't eat from this one specific tree. Eat from the tree of life. Don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which only belongs to God, according to God. Um, you know, there, and God never, in the Bible, never really fully explains why Adam and Eve shouldn't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, other than the reason, like, this knowledge is mine. there's no real reason ever given by the Edo or the Edo god, like why you shouldn't be in these specific white, fenced off spaces with the white fencing. It's I don't want to say that the story in the Bible is a story of God's arbitrary sense of control, but it seems like in some ways the Edo god has enforced some sort of sense of order with a. It seems arbitrary to us because I just don't think that there's enough world building to explain why these fenced off areas are so important, besides them being holding nice flower beds.
Well, see, just to comment on that, one of my notes is and thoughts was that there's, as you just said, there's an absolute aspect to the Edo law.
Unless the
And
absolute aspect is to keep absolute order.
yes, and again, remember in 1987, they were already starting to talk about the morality of the death penalty, and there gets into part of the philosophizing that Picard has, and some of it is, with the brief discussion he has with the Edo god, gets into the non-absolute nature of laws and that they actually evolve. That humans used to have the death penalty, but humans don't use that anymore. And then there's a comment at the very end that I think Riker makes that laws are more than a rule book. So, when he says that, what does that mean? It sort of
Well, Picard cuts this promo to the Edo god right before, because
Yes,
he tries to beam away
right.
with Wesley, and the Edo god, which we'll get back into this Edo god creature in a moment, because he has the power to stop the crew from beaming back to the ship.
Yes.
It's very clear that this Edo god has a superior level of technology to the Enterprise. Putting that aside for a moment, Picard cuts his promo where he says, his mind has been weighed lately by the question of justice and law, and that laws can't be so strict to take away the possibilities and the situations that life just throws at us. And this kind of goes back to a conversation he has with Data in his quarters,
Right.
about Data comes and like, well, we really kind of have to make a choice here. By the Prime Directive, we can't interfere with the Edo's laws. Wesley has broken their law. And by the Prime Directive, we have to let the Edo met out their own cultural system of justice. But Picard's argument, and I think he's right and he's wrong. Picard's argument is that the Prime Directive wasn't suited for every application of every incident, including this one. Like he's saying, like, I have
right.
to, there is holding the responsibility to the Prime Directive, but I also have to hold to the responsibility of what's right. And what's right in my mind is the safety of this crew. And in the moment, the safety of the crew is the safety of Wesley Crusher.
Well, what what you say about Picard doing the promo with the God entity toward the end, where he said, we have the Prime Directive, we work to respect that, and at the same time, I have the responsibility to assure the safety of my crew, so I cannot let Wesley be, executed, for the accidental event that happened on the planet. And then after that comment, the Edo god lets the Enterprise people beam back up and leave. And that gets into one of the things I thought when I watched the episode for the first time, the idea of moral relativism. And it seemed like, even though the Edo like God did not discuss things with Picard, they were wise enough to say, okay, we're dealing with two different cultures here. I need to let these humans off a little bit. There was a certain sophistication, perhaps, in understanding the position the the position, if not the dilemma that Picard was in.
I think that there's also a certain aspect of like, I think that in some ways this Edo god is probably cut off from the rest of the universe because it's sitting on this kind of dimensional fold between our space time and whatever space time it's existing in as well.
Right.
Um, I think, I don't think that it ever expected like the Enterprise to show up and start interacting with its people clearly. But I think once it interacts with Data, it realizes to a certain extent, and this, of course, is purely conjecture on my end, but I think it also realizes, okay, if I keep fucking with these humans, this particular set of humans, they're a gigantic galactic organization that just put a colony on another planet in my system that didn't have people on it is going to come and is going to come with a fleet of more of these ships that are definitely going to detect me now, and they're going to mess with my children down in my Edo garden. I think there is a certain aspect of this too where the Edo god is like, you know what, this is getting out of hand, and it's
Well,
more trouble
yeah,
than it's
yeah,
worth.
that's a good point. The Edo god seems to be territorial, and he doesn't want to give up its parenting of the Edo people. Because one of the things that Picard proposes to the Edo god when they're back on the Enterprise is that he realizes that they've sort of impinged on the sort of the territorial sense that the Edo god has over that system, and says, we're going to remove the human colony from the other planet and the system.
Yeah,
And there's no response from the Edo god other than the ship, since it's transdimensional, it just disappears from view, which is construed as being, yes, that's good, let's go our separate ways.
yeah. Well, it means that like these, clearly the Edo god, like we've said, is a craft, which means it's technology, which means that these are not really omnipotent beings or
Right.
really omnipresent. Because if they were
Right.
omnipresent, they would have seen the Enterprise coming.
Right.
Um, I think what this says is that we're dealing with either beings or beings. Let's say it's a crew of a ship. That are willing to negotiate for their best interests, including, I think maybe even the best interests of the Edo themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, there's a protective aspect to this and a parenting aspect to this, where I think there's two different sorts of parenting being measured. And it's interesting that you and I are talking about this, especially since the purpose of the show is something for Ben later on for him to listen to if he wants. Um, you know, your journey of being a father to me, and then my journey of being a father to him, you've come across challenges in terms of disciplining me and my sisters. I'm sure I will come across challenges disciplining Ben as he gets older. I think there is two different methods of parenting being looked at here between the kind of more humane concern that Picard shows as a father versus the kind of authoritative, maybe totalitarian, but genuine concern that the Edo god shows for his children down on Rubicon 3, especially Ravan when he realizes like, oh no, they beamed her up on the Enterprise. She's out of the garden. She's loose. I think that
when
that it,
when right, when she beams up to the Enterprise, it's like she's eaten the apple.
yes, well, like, she realizes there's a city up here and that there's these people and that they have these powers too, and maybe this god that
She jumps to the conclusion that since the Enterprise and Picard are in the sky, where their God is in the sky, because they've seen an image of the craft at some point, that Picard and the Enterprise must be godlike also.
and Picard wisely, um, and I've always kind of respected the show for this.
Right.
They go out of their way to make sure that the Edo know that we are not gods. We are
Yes.
just humans. We have technology. We have science. We have these abilities that we developed over a long history of challenge and struggle and achievement.
Right.
Um, I think that's a really important moment. It kind of speaks to, like, you made this note about the Prime Directive in terms of colonization and territorial issues. You know, colonization, I think, is an interesting term because on one hand there is like the physical colonization of settling land, in this case in the Star Trek universe settling interstellar planets, but there's also the colonization of thought. Like, when you put a Federation colony into a system, those Federation citizens are carrying with them a set of ideas, and if they run into the natives of another planet or maybe on the same planet, maybe those Federation colonists would have taken their ship anyway at some point down the line and just made the leapfrog over to Rubicon 3 and discovered the Edo anyway. We carry with each other when colonists from Europe, when they came and met the Native Americans, they didn't just carry disease blankets and gunpowder and things like that. They also carried ideas like Christianity and commerce and capitalism, things that were drastically foreign to the indigenous peoples here. I think on one hand, the Edo god is is in a is kind of having a moment of panic because it it keeps its children in this very stringent system of very narrow ideas, where Picard comes from a society and culture where their entire purpose is to explore and not interfere, where the Edo god is directly interfering, even though it seems he does so in a passive way. So, I think there is a fear of colonization here by the Edo god, but it's the
Hmm.
fear of the idea that Ravon, like you mentioned, Ravon quickly mentions when she's finally brought on board the Enterprise that, like, okay, there's more than one being that has this technology, this ability to do these miraculous things. But it's the moment when Picard says, "No, I'm not a god." I think that's the moment where, like, the Edo god kind of goes like, "Shit, shit.
Well, the other
I have to play this very carefully
well,
because
that's a
now
good
they're going to wonder about me."
well, that's the other good point because the Edo god, from knowing from putting ourselves in the from the perspective of the Enterprise crew of 24th century uh, humans traveling throughout the galaxy, they know that the Edo god entity is not God.
Yes.
However, the Edo god is perfectly comfortable portraying itself
Hmm.
as God to the Edo.
Yes. Which says something about, I it's wrong to anthropomorphize and assume that the Edo god or the crew of the Edo god craft are human-like in any way.
Just to shift a little bit. That's one of the things in terms of my evolution of thinking about God is that one of the things I remember being taught
Yeah.
is that God created the world and people because he needed to be worshiped
In the Judeo-Christian sense,
in the
he
Judeo-Christian sense. And I'm thinking if God is omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent, then why is there a need for God in the Judeo Christian sense to even have the need to be worshiped?
why the ego?
Why the ego?
Yes. Um,
Exactly.
I think it gets into uh kind of straying back for a moment to the ancient alien motif.
Uh huh.
I'm thinking about other stories where the ancient alien motif has occurred, and most ancient alien motifs really do center around this idea of another civilization seeding the next civilization that comes after them. Um, just giving some quick examples for the audience outside of Star Trek with the Edo and this Edo god. Um, the premise of Stargate SG-1 or the Stargate universe is that this parasitic species called the Goa'uld actually kidnapped humans from Earth thousands of years ago, bred them, and then bred them as slaves that they seeded throughout the universe. So every time the Stargate team goes through the Stargate, they come upon a planet that is seeded with humans already that were previously placed there by an ancient alien civilization. Um, Aliens versus Predator. It's established early on, I think, in AVP, which takes place in Antarctica.
Mm.
That one of the reasons why pyramid structures are so common among different human civilizations on Earth is that the predators, as an ancient alien civilization, actually seeded the idea within these civilizations to promote their own hunting culture among ancient Earth communities. Um, there is also there is also the ancient alien idea in Scientology that there was a galactic overlord named Xenu who ruled over thousands of planets. And as a way to basically call the planets for resources, this is actually what Scientologists believe, folks, um, basically threw billions of aliens into the Earth's ancient volcanoes and seeded uh, the Earth with all of these ancient alien souls, which plague us today. They believe that. Anyway, um, so ancient alien stories proliferate throughout science fiction.
Mhm.
I think the one here is interesting because it's not a world of the Edo. It's really kind of just this community of Edo. It doesn't seem like this is a thriving civilization. And it seems sometimes maybe like, and it's a concept I'm playing with in the novel that I mentioned, the urban fantasy novel that has a lot to do with the Garden of Eden. Um, there might be very much kind of a laboratory aspect to the Edo down on Rubicon 3. Like, what if God is running kind of a social experiment? Or the Edo God is just trying to see, like, I'm managing my children, I'm trying to raise them to see what kind of people I can raise or what people I can kind of cultivate and produce. If I set this very controlled laboratory experiment on this planet and the Enterprise, led by this shameful bald man who keeps saying that he's not a god, even though he needs to, because I'm a god and I need him to say that I'm a better god than him, which doesn't happen, by the way.
Correct.
Um, I need, I kind of need to be left alone to basically be allowed to conduct my experiments. Um, I I think there is kind of an ancient alien aspect to that here. Oh, also, did you ever see the movie Prometheus by Ridley Scott? It's also in the Aliens
I
universe.
have not seen that. No.
That one's about humans were seeded by an ancient civilization in that one too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the point I'm trying to get to is that in a lot of these ancient alien stories, these gods are usually doing it because they're using humanity as kind of lab rats in a way. And we never really established the fact of, like, what is the Edo god actually doing here? Why is the Edo god, because there's a I can't remember her name, and it's a much later season. I think it's like season 6, 5 or 6. They go to that planet where the civilization made a pact with the devil,
Oh,
and
yes. Right.
yeah, that story explains like how the devil got this power in
Right.
that storyline. Like, this planet made this pact. why is the Edo god here overlooking these overlooking his children, and what is he doing? We never really have that established. And like you said, getting back around to the original thing we were kind of talking about on this point, Picard and the crew kind of disappear, and we don't really know what happens to the Edo afterwards. So the effects of colonization, which the Prime Directive really takes the time to consider, are kind of thrown out the window along with the Prime Directive in this episode. Do you have any thoughts or reaction to that?
Yeah, I think the whole, idea of theme of colonization in this episode, it's, it does sort of potentially conflict with the Prime Directive, because if you go into a planet and if you go into a system that it's uninhabited, but it's class M, or it's some other class, could be minimally terraformed so that humans can live there. There's a comment in this episode that says, we put humans there so they can develop it. And since they will be separate from Earth and other colonies, they will develop their own society and culture.
Yes.
And, that gets into the ancient aliens story about seeding, as we're here. What we're saying is a theme throughout science fiction, and that some people actually believe there is evidence of ancient alien visitation and so forth, and having an effect on the development of humans and human society. This is a different type of colonization compared with what we've experienced on Earth, going back to European colonization and so forth, because when the Europeans, for instance, and there's so much discussion of it now relative to, racism, racial issues, and things of that sort. When the Europeans came to the Americas after the Columbus, they were coming to stay. They weren't just going to go and get all the gold and go back. They came and were going to, they were claiming it for God, Spain, and gold, which was really kind of in the reverse order. It was for gold, they wanted to get rich, and then they did it for their monarch, whether it be Spain or France. And then, God was, just, in my opinion, was just an excuse and so on.
If he fits.
But God was very important, because part of Western civilization was that we're out to proselytize. We are going to tame the barbarians, whether they be Muslims or, Buddhist in Indonesia, or, people in China, or the Shinto Japanese, and so forth. And there's a very interesting book, if you read one of the authors, who called Flags of Our Fathers. Oh, the other one is about the Great White Fleet, which was the same author that wrote Flags of Our Fathers, basically said that part of Western proselytization was one of the causes of World War II, is that we basically made the Japanese surrogate white men. James Bradley. We made the Japanese surrogate white men, said, look, since you've modernized and, you've got naval ships now, you got weapons and so forth, if you want to go conquer the Chinese because they're savages, they're not civilized like the West is, that's fine.
Yeah, that's very true.
And Japanese said, "Oh, now that you're giving us that, we'll create our own little empire in East Asia, and screw you, Europe and the Americans."
It was a huge part of the Meiji Restoration. You're absolutely right. I think one thing that you noted in terms of colonization is kind of like and I previously discussed as well, kind of the engendering of certain ideas. I think one thing that is noted is the Ito's reaction to Picard when he says, like, I'm not going to let you kill Wesley, essentially. They're the ones to first like lay the actual label on themselves. Well, you must think that we're barbaric and you're not going to respect our laws because of course we must be barbaric and you have all this power and you could just take him from us if you wanted. And it's
Yes.
very interesting, you know, because even though Picard has kind of violated Picard and the crew have violated the Prime Directive, this episode does a lot to actually define it in a way. Because the Edo automatically assume that the Enterprise and the Federation will use their greater technological power to take from them.
Hmm.
That these people with this greater technology will automatically assume the Edo are barbarians, and that their laws have no place to be respected. And literally, Picard, point by point, shoots that down in that conversation, where we're trying our best to respect your laws. We don't want to. We don't actually want to. We don't actually think that you're barbaric, and we don't actually want to be here and actually affect your society in any way. And it's just a very telling aspect of the Prime Directive and of the Society of the Federation in general that, from the point that we've reached where, you know, we've modernized you so you're like us, so you might as well go out and act like us. We've completely gone in a 180 to where you should remain as natural to your state as you are if you've never met us before. And we will just try to interact with you the best we can if we can.
Well, yeah, it's like we've redefined what colonization means.
Exactly.
And because what I just thought about going back to the original series, there was that one episode where the Enterprise with Spock and Kirk were called to the mining planet because
Yes.
there was silicon-based creature called the Horta. And the crew of the Enterprise, the miners wanted to be killed because it was killing their men and so forth. And they figured out that when they
I
were
love that episode, by
when
the
they
way.
were going through and mining the minerals of this planet, they were breaking into these chambers and they found these spheres that were actually the eggs of the Horta that they
Mm-hmm.
didn't recognize because the Horta was a silicon based life form. And Spock and Kirk and McCoy figured that out and explained to uh, the miners, said, look, this is why the Horde is attacking you. And they said, well, we didn't know. We could live peacefully in a symbiotic relationship, with the Horda. So again, it's, this world was colonized for the minerals by humans. And again, the they were colonizing it. They were rapaciously removing minerals, raw materials from this planet. But at the same time, they realized that there was a life form that didn't understand, that they ended up not wanting to harm, but live in harmony with it. So again, it's mankind was evolving in terms of how it colonized. And part of this is the realization that there were other life forms, that you had to respect those other life forms, that they were going to be different.
Absolutely. And just for reference, everyone, Jake's actually representing the Devil in the Dark, which is episode uh 26 of season 1 of
Mm.
the original series of Star Trek, which aired on March 9th of 1967. Excuse me for a second. Ooh. Uh, take a sip of water. I think those are a lot of really great points. Because one thing that I think um, colonization kind of automatically leads to when it's handled in kind of the way that's been historically handled in our current history is that it often leads to conflict and usually the destruction of kind of the lesser advanced culture. However, I think one aspect that we have to talk about here is the Edo God itself in terms of being able to access the information's being able to access the information in terms on the Enterprise and hacking its computer systems, even to the point of incapacitating data.
Mm-hmm.
You know, on one hand, there's another problem with the episode in terms of not only the fact that they leave like the Edo behind to have to be sorted out with sort out issues with their god on their own. They've also left behind this entity that can hack into Federation systems, somehow skirts on the border between two dimensions, which means that the Enterprise can detect it, but they can't lock their weapons on it, and can somehow stop the crew from being able to transport themselves to and from the ship. They've left behind this entity or multiple entities that has, in some aspects, a superior level of technology to them. What happens when another civilization, be it the Ferengi or the Klingons or the Romulans, or another Federation ship, runs into them? Or what if this thing decides to run off on its own one day because something disastrous happens to the Edo in the garden below on the planet of Rubicon 3? You made a note of Russia, China, and the U.S. in our relationship in terms of the kind of cybersecurity threats we're all placing each other in right now. But the technological ability of the Edo god makes it a very distinct threat. And I think it's very interesting that in 1967, it's kind of passed off a little bit in this episode.
You're talking about 1987.
I'm sorry, 1987. I said
Right.
67. In 1987, this is kind of passed off, but here in 2021, this has real implications. And I just wanted to ask you, in 1987, with Reagan and kind of being towards the tail end of the Cold War, and Reagan had the Star Wars program, which was an anti-ballistic missile system that ultimately didn't get off the ground.
Right.
What was the view of was there any real discussion of like cybersecurity or cyber warfare at the time?
We'd have to look it up because, it was DARPA where the idea of the internet really came from, because they wanted to have a communications modality to survive a nuclear war. And, they started, I guess, working with some universities and so forth. So I don't remember that the first email was like it in the early 90s or something like that. And it started to show up. I remember at work where I was, maybe 95, I heard about email because you started to have, computer networks within companies, and you had an intranet so that you could email one another. And then people realized, oh, well, if you connect through the internet, then we can email one another, words. And I can't remember how soon it was that you could attach a document and so on. But since there was no internet in the late 80s, I think that in terms of, intelligence gathering, it was more based upon signals intelligence and human intelligence and that sort of thing. And it probably started happening much sooner than we know from a military perspective, probably in the early 2000s, that militaries and governments started to figure out, well, I wonder if we can somehow access databases in Russia and even in our allies, which we've done, to find out what they're doing, what they're thinking, what technology they have. I mean, one of the really good examples was something that, your uncle may have been involved with. I don't think he did this because I think this was basically in the Pacific. Was you had American submarines that went into the Sea of Okhotsk and tapped into a seafloor cable that carried Russian military communications, and they would put some sort of sensor on that would collect data. And then an American submarine had a way to collect that collector so that they could, actually read Russian intelligence in terms of military operations, naval operations in that part of the world. So the whole idea of you know, um, um, being able to access another military or another government's database. Back then it was I don't think it was cyber at all.
Hmm.
It was just starting then. I'm sure that somebody at DARPA was thinking about it, was smart enough to realize, well, this is where this is going to go. So we need to start thinking about it now. And I'm sure that there were smart Russians and Chinese and Indians thinking the same thing.
Um, taking kind of also a quick dovetail, kind of maybe back into the culture of the late '80s. Um, one thing that noted about the episode, and the second time I watched it with Mario, in fact, and she noted it too, that there is a very distinct change in the mood of the episode when Wesley finally breaks into that flower bed,
Mm-hmm.
where there is a sense that there is a little bit of a brothel element to Rubicon 3 and the Edo. And there is this and it's been mentioned previously before, like there's this kind of expectation by the crew of the Enterprise, and they demonstrate it when they get down to the planet. Yard demonstrated when uh, embraces Lator.
Right.
That's what his name is,
Right.
Liator.
Yeah.
Yeah, Liator.
Uh-huh.
Um, even even Troy like doesn't necessarily reciprocate to his advances negatively.
Right.
There's also this scene where like Riker and Worf are talking about like, well, it's very obvious these people would offer themselves to Worf if Worf would have them. Why does
Mm-hmm.
Worf not partake? And they have this very kind of blunt conversation about like clean on sex for Worf is too rough for like human women,
Right.
which is a very kind of like upfront conversation I don't think that you necessarily expect sometimes in Star Trek, because there
Yes.
isn't really like upfront conversations about sex. But I'm just wondering, like, in there's a note you had about like Roddenberry.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so Roddenberry definitely had an interest in sex. Um, in fact, a very lurid and somehow somewhat perverse interest in sex.
We we have talked about this.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I think that we've talked about the story about how Deanna Troi was originally supposed to be kind of this oversexed alien with three breasts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but and that was an original idea by Roddenberry, who really wanted to see kind of an over sexualized character, but the producers shot that down. Um, I think the idea of somehow there being planets that are quote unquote brothel like is, I think, a fair one because, in this universe, there's clearly Risa. But it gets into the question of like, are these sex workers or are these people who are just having free sex and free love? And it gets, to the question of like 1987 maybe versus like 1968 or 1963 with the hippie movement or the free love movement, where there was this idea that, people would be able to have free sexual relations, and have it communally, and somehow that there would be this kind of nexus of relationships built that sustain themselves into this better kind of humanistic relationship. There were a lot of hippie movements that believed that through the free love movement.
Mm-hmm.
But, there is kind of this lurid quality in this 1987 episode of like, everyone's kind of down here to get laid.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was nothing that made me uncomfortable about the discussion of sex in the episode. There was a little bit of discomfort when, like, not even really discomfort, just it wasn't as funny as I think the writers thought it would be. Where like they're figuring out like, what do we do with Wesley now that he's down here in front of all these adults that are clearly willing to get it on with each other. Um, I I think part of it is like Roddenberry is clearly a little bit of a horn dog.
Hmm.
I also just think that in the culture of Star Trek and in the future, we have a much more liberal view of sex than even we have now.
Did you say livable?
Liberal,
Liberal. Oh
a
yeah,
much more
because
liberalized view of
I mean,
sex than what we do now.
it only pops up now and then, but there's this. I think one of the places where it comes up is going back to Enterprise, which of course was produced in the early 2000 to 2005.
Yeah,
There's the sexual relationship and tension between um, T'Pol and
and Trip.
Trip, but there are at one time there's a little bit of a sexual tension between Archer and T'Pol as
Hmm.
well, and it's related to being under stress and the acknowledgement that adult humans have sexual needs, that is psychologically important and so forth. And
And they happen naturally working in confined spaces on a
right,
consistent basis with each other
and then they don't really,
in
they
terms of
just,
attraction.
yeah, they don't resolve that issue, but there is some mention in Next Generation that they resolve that because, hey, if you need to go to the holodeck to relieve yourself, go ahead, you can reserve it
It,
and
it's
create whatever kind of fantasy you want.
it's actually how the doctor fixes the Pon farr symptoms of a Vulcan crewmate on Voyager,
Ah,
where he
yeah.
basically creates kind of like a Vulcan brothel for this guy to go in and have at whenever he wants. Um, I think there's a big conversation in the modern world today about liberalizing our views on sex work and sex workers, especially in terms of the form of legalized prostitution, which in countries, especially like Belgium or the Netherlands, where they have legalized prostitution, not only are these girls and guys making living wages, but they're also able to access a first world healthcare system. A lot
Right.
of them are allowed legal protections that sex workers are not allowed in any other part of the world. And for the most part, it's just another part of society, kind of like marijuana in coffee shops and um, existentialism. That's a weird pairing. But I think the conversations they would probably have in the future of Star Wars don't even talk about sex work because we have an economy where scarcity doesn't exist in Star Trek. So it might just be like people have a voluntary culture where like, hey, if you want to have sex with people with multiple partners, a single partner, no partners, if you want to self-identify or explore your sexuality in any way you see fit within the constraints of morality, a certain morality or ethic where you don't harm someone, in the future they're probably 100% okay with it. And like you said, they have a holodeck. In a holodeck, what would stop you from exploring, you know, your most sensual but maybe even your most debased desires?
Mhm.
I mean, there is a level to that too.
Well, just from a science fiction perspective and thinking science fiction as a projection of what the future could be like in the Star Trek universe, you're dealing with not just humans, but other species. And there's not a lot of detail, but there's reference made to sexual practices of other species are different from humans.
Hmm.
So again, if it kind of mirrors,
Well, we also have like people crossbreeding. Like
sure,
in this season, I think it will be this season. We will meet Alexander's mother,
yes,
who's half human, half
Klingon, half
Klingon.
human, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
So I think the question when it comes to like the view of sex in the future versus maybe Roddenberry's intention. Roddenberry may be intending to be a little bit lurid, but I think the view that Star Trek puts forward, just like their viewpoint when it comes to like things like the death penalty,
Hmm.
sex is not something that to take kind of this Puritan, restrictive, almost authoritarian measure against. It has
Well,
to be measured against like the actual lived experiences of people and the situations they find themselves in.
and see, this gets back to the whole thing of, how do in the Star Trek universe, how do 24th century humans perceive of God? Um, they they don't, from what we get, it's they don't have religion is not an issue there. They know it historically. They probably there's some. I can't remember any place in Next Generation where they mention Christianity at all. There's some mention of Christianity in um, one of the original series where there is something to do with Rome and so forth.
Oh
And
yeah.
Spock says that, well, what's happening is the philosophy of Jesus is spreading on this world. But he says philosophy, not religion.
Well, I think one thing that they probably have in terms of conceit in the Star Trek universe is that they know there are things that are unexplainable, and going back to kind of the Heinlein principle, any technology that isn't readily explainable would be perceived as magic.
Magic, yes.
Um, so, and it seems like you're right. There isn't necessarily religion, but there is definitely spirituality practiced by many of them.
Yes, yes.
And there are religious systems still practiced by individual species. Like the Klingons have individual religious practices, including a monastery in Borith, where they expect Kalis to return. Um, the Vulcans have the teachings of Surak, and even to
Mm-hmm.
the point where like Spock has kind of a religious space in his quarters
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, on the Enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
Even Worf has, I think, religious iconography in his quarters on the Enterprise D.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, like, I don't think there is necessarily a sense of being anti-spiritual,
No, for
but in
sure.
terms of like institutionalized religion, it doesn't have any sort. It doesn't seem to have any sort of real sway when it comes to like these major powers here in the Alpha Quadrant. Now,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and, it's the one species that I think hasn't really ever been explored entirely in Star Trek. We don't really know about the Romulans and how they view the universe, but it
Mm-hmm.
seems very much like for example, the Klingons. The story of Kalis is that the Klingons killed their own gods at one point.
Mm.
And that Kalis was kind of like the divine, was a mortal Klingon who made himself kind of into a god figure, which
They're
which is
sort of
a
like
which is a common story in our ancient myths too.
right because it goes with the ancient Greek gods and the Titans.
Yeah, well, especially Sumerian myths like Gilgamesh.
Ah,
There's like
yes, right.
yeah, there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
stories of Gilgamesh kind of obtaining godlike abilities through killing other gods or
Mm-hmm.
other godlike beings.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think one of the reasons why like Picard is I don't think Picard's strictly an atheist, but I think in terms of like having the idea that there is this kind of single entity out there that is dictating all the laws and nature of the universe, I think most people by then have probably moved away from that.
Yes.
And it seems like most of the stories, even in most of the stories in Star Trek, even when it comes to the main races, are more philosophical in origin. Like the story
Yes.
of Kalis is the story of a warrior's philosophy. The the story of Surak is the philosophy of mediating the conflict within, so it does not actually affect the world without. Uh, the Prime Directive is the story of exploration without creating any real damage, because we have an entire human history of exploring while not taking into account the consequences of that exploration.
Right.
So, I think there's and even Picard, the Prime Directive, in terms of the Prime Directive, is very much a spiritual thing for him. And even in Picard, one of the reasons, the Picard series that came out in 2019, one of the reasons it's so, I'm sorry, yeah, 2019.
Yeah.
Finn was born. Sorry, folks, taking a sip. That sounds gross. One of the reasons, Picard is so broken in the Picard series is because he kind of has this spiritual deference to Starfleet and the ideas of the Federation and the Prime Directive. And when he sees Starfleet finally fail that in terms of being able to take care of the Romulans after they've lost their world, he's a man without faith. He's lost his faith in everything, and that's why he's retreated to his vineyard in France, and he's kind of broken by all things. I don't think Picard's an atheist. I just think his God is Starfleet, his Bible's the Prime Directive, and his flock or his disciples are his crew. In some ways, there's this really, and I kind of look at you the same way. And for everyone at home, this is going to sound really emotional on my end, but like, Picard's deeply is my hero in a very, very deep way, just like you are, Dad, because it's there's a scene where like Beverly's really freaking out. And you don't really ever measure those kind of scenes, and I think, until you're a parent, until you have your own, and you realize that there's so much risk in the world to them. And Picard kind of looks at her and says, like, no matter what happens, I'm not going to let them hurt your son. And like, there's this moment, and part of it's because Gates McFadden's a really great actress, but part of it's like the character history between Picard and Beverly, where, I'm not going to leave your son behind or let him die, because she knows that like there's a potential that he could leave Wesley behind. He could let Wesley die, because he let Jack die. He left Jack behind.
In the episode, it's a continuation of, and they actually do this we're only on episode, 7 or 8. And it's very quickly that it establishes, if people are paying attention, the relationship between Picard and Beverly, that they knew one another when they were young. And Jack Crusher was very good friends with, an Academy classmate. And, he, was in a situation where he could not save Jack. So,
I kind of think that Jack's on the Stargazer when Picard's under command of the Stargazer, and that's what
I think
that's
so.
where it happens.
Yeah, I think it was the Stargazer. Yes. So
and Beverly and Wesley weren't on board; they were on Earth, and then Picard actually brings Jack home to Wesley and Beverly after what happens aboard the Stargazer.
So there's this very intimate relationship, and there was some before Beverly and Jack became married. There was obviously seemed to be some emotional attachment or attraction between Beverly and Jean-Luc, so that when you first see Wesley on the Enterprise, Picard is surprised because he apparently looks like his father. And there's this connection where because of the relationship, what's evolving is that Picard is getting a little bit to be Wesley's surrogate father.
Yeah.
He may be, Picard's, I don't know if Wesley sees him in that role, but Picard sees him in that role. And he feels the responsibility to keeping what's left of that family intact. So he's not going to sacrifice Wesley.
I think that I think the reason why Picard's so heroic to me is that there is this very. I think it gets back to counter at Farpoint and everything he says to Q. Like, we've made mistakes, but we redeem ourselves every time we decide to do something different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Picard is in a very tight spot where, you know, he needs to measure his duty to Starfleet because he really can be court-martialed and lose his career, but also lose his ship,
Mm-hmm.
and really violate something that he holds dear. But there is a morality to, and I guess this gets to the question of the question of moral relativism versus the absoluteness of law. Wesley accidentally fell into a flower bed that was deemed a forbidden space. To put a boy to death for accidentally falling into a flower bed that he had no knowledge of as being a
Oh
forbidden
yes.
space
Right.
is immoral.
Yes.
Forget the prime directive and forget the law of the Edo. There is an inflexibility there that if you kill him over that, that is way worse than anything that he could have done rolling around on those flowers. And I think Picard is, here placing the humanity of Wesley and maybe the validity of his own humanity
Well, and
above the duty he has to the prime directive and the duty he kind of somewhat has to the Edo through it.
and it gets into
And that's
the
very heroic.
it does, and it gets into the judicial aspect of moral relativism, because one of the things that's going on now is that have really active innocence project now, where
Mm-hmm.
people, particularly people of color, that have been imprisoned for many years on trumped up charges, and there's you know organizations out there and people out there that have the resources to get the evidence to prove, go back to courts and say, look, this person was incorrectly convicted of this crime, and they're being let out. And a lot of it has to do with just racial prejudice on the part of district attorneys and so on. And the other thing that I made a note of, talking, something you and I have talked about, that is again a little bit of a sidebar type thing. um, the U.S. Constitution is looked upon as being sacrosanct by many, the originalist.
Oh
And one of
yeah.
the things we've talked about is, in terms of, there's all this discussion all the time. Well, what did the founding fathers? What did they really intend? And to me, it is totally ridiculous to try to understand or project what the
Well,
founding fathers would think about how we live now, and how our legal structure and legal concepts may have to change. And a discussion you and I've had
mm-hmm.
in past years is the U.S. Constitution needs many, many, many more amendments to it. And if you have that many amendments to it, does it get to the point that it really should be rewritten, not scrapped, but you do U.S. Constitution V2?
Well, you know, I will get to the answering that. But getting back to the episode real quick, and I think
Sure.
the reason I wanted to interrupt is because I actually think that there is some real connections to what you're positing with the episode itself in terms of measuring moral relevance against the absolutism of law. Um, one thing, there's this comedian that I love named Joe Rogan, and he has this joke about how, first, one of two things when it comes to the Constitution. He believes that we shouldn't have a president anymore. He thinks the idea of one person handling the executive branch of a nation is just too much for one person to handle. So we need to break up that office. It's told as a joke, but I actually think that's a very interesting proposition. You know, if we not only change the Constitution, why don't we actually change the offices themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Um, But the second one was like, he told this joke about like if we got Thomas Jefferson and brought him back to 2020s to 2017 when this special was recorded, Thomas Jefferson would be like, "You didn't write any new shit?
Right.
I wrote that with a feather. You have smartphones." Like,
You have Microsoft Word.
but I think that there's a really important point here. Like when people talk about the intention of the original founders and framers of the Constitution, I think that they forget that most of these founders were modern. The majority of these founders were modern men who were very forward looking into the future, which is why they held up things like secular values, the freedom of the press, freedom from government seizure, the overreach of law
They were
enforcement.
truly revolutionary ideas.
Yes, and the important thing about revolutionary ideas is that they only remain revolutionary if they are able to progress into the future and change in a revolutionary fashion.
They have to be able to evolve as the context changes.
Yes, and what Picard is realizing, as Thomas Jefferson would realize if he came in 2017, is that morality is not relative, but context matters in determining its bounds. You know, it is immoral to murder is immoral it is immoral to execute Wesley for an accident
Yes.
versus, Picard thinks like, okay, we colonize an uninhabited planet that belongs to this Edo god system. Maybe we have to leave that.
Mhm.
There's very much an evolutionary thinking going on here where Picard has been taught to keep this thought in his mind that, like, what is my real role in determining the bounds of what I do here? What is the actual result of my decision making? And what is the karma that will be produced by what I do versus the dharma that I'm supposed to be pursuing?
Mhm.
Um, if I'm using a lot of Hinduism ideas, folks, from the Bhagavad Gita, look it up. It's a wonderful book. Um, but I think getting to the question of the sanctity of the Constitution and kind of the current ethic versus future ethic, I think I think the problem that we have today, and this is kind of getting into the sidebar, but I think the episode Justice points out to it is that there is there's this expectation that society, if it's supposed to be function, remains kind of in this static state. And the truth is, if it remains in a static state, it stagnates. And things like law and custom can quickly become outmoded and outdated, and maybe to a certain extent, actually harmful. And I think one thing that Picard argues right before the Edo god lets them off the planet is like, I've been weighed over the last few days with questions of the law and the bounds of morality. And
Mhm.
what I'm discovering, and I think you, Edo god, as I pray up to you in front of these people, somehow maintaining your dignity as a god. Because he does. No, he does. Like
Oh
Picard
no, you're right.
Picard
Absolutely.
kind of beseeches, plays the
Yes.
part of a supplicant to God. Um, Kind of beseeches him and says, like, life is not measured by these absolute scenarios. And even like Riker says, you pointed
Laws
it.
are more than a rule book.
Yeah, laws are more than a rule book. Laws are bounds. They're not strictures and they're not borders. They're just boundaries. They're boundaries to the rules of the field. And like, just the general rules of our everyday life. Like we're not supposed to murder people because if we're allowed to murder people left and right, society would break down. But that doesn't mean like if if someone's trying to murder you, unjustly, you can't defend yourself. And in the process of defending yourself, possibly murder them or kill them in the process
Mm-hmm.
of defending yourself. The law has to be flexible enough to
Mm-hmm.
realize that in the situation that you were being attacked, you may have had, and you may not have been in your right mind at the moment because being in a violent scenario is very, very scary.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were under attack and you didn't do anything to provoke that person, and in the process of defending yourself, you kill that person, morally, you may not be at fault. The law has to be open enough to realize that, just like it has to be open enough to realize that this teenager just tripped over something and accidentally fell into a flower bed.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, talking about the death penalty in this episode, it's kind of sloppily done because the question of like whether or not killing someone is an appropriate response to infractions against the law isn't really discussed as much
No.
as the validity of the law itself.
Right.
And
Right.
just touching on this for a moment, and I would love to hear your thoughts, Dad, and I'm sure Ben would for posterity as well. Um, I am I am against the death penalty. I think that in a progressive, humane society, there are ways to rehabilitate and contain individuals who have done wrong, hopefully with the goal of rehabilitating them. But I don't think that death, in the majority of cases, um, works. I think now I will say in certain cases, like I think let's say at the end of World War II, we had actually captured Hitler when the Russians took Berlin. Like I think we would have hung Hitler, and I don't think anyone would have looked around the room and said like, "Oh, we shouldn't do this." Um, but overall, I think solving crimes with the death penalty has become outdated. And like you mentioned with the Innocence Project, a lot of these people that we have discovered have been put on death row have not been put on there with the best evidence to establish them needing to be there.
I, I am perplexed about the death penalty because my tendency is that, well, first of all, when people are given the death penalty, the court should be so sure of the evidence that there should not be this opportunity for multiple appeals and so forth, so the person goes on death row and is in prison for another 20 years. If they were guilty and you give them the death penalty, after a very short time, they should be executed. I mean, I have a problem with that right there. I think the thing that I can't decide, where I'm between, you hit the nail on the head, is can an individual be rehabilitated? I think there are some people that are psychopaths, sociopaths, whatever, and you cannot fix them by putting them into a mental institution. You cannot fix them by putting them in prison.
Yeah.
So you either decide that we're going to just, that their crime is so heinous that we're going to execute them, or they're just going to go to prison for life.
But it's important to remember that when it comes to psychopaths and sociopaths, statistically they are such a minute part of the general population.
Yes.
But continues.
But and the last comment is the other thing I think about is I think that there are some crimes against humanity. For instance,
Yes.
What a lot of the Nazis did during the Holocaust, and against any of the peoples they prosecuted, Jews, artists, gypsies, homosexuals, etc. What they did to those people,
Dissenters.
that could not be tolerated. Anybody who knowingly and willingly participated in those pogroms, in those mass executions, they definitely the answer from humanity is you're not going to exist anymore.
Well,
And I
like,
think I
yeah.
think it's a problem right now is, you know, what are the Chinese doing to the Uyghurs?
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, does it? I mean, it's not genocide in the sense that it's what the Nazis tried to do to the Jewish population of Europe, but it's definitely cultural genocide that they're doing against the Uyghurs right now.
So the
And I heard a story recently that there's some Chinese, Han Chinese, that are communicating with Uyghurs that they know that they're apologizing for what the communist regime is doing.
well the issue with the Uyghurs is that so far what most reliable media sources have told us is that the Chinese have collected over 1 million Uyghur Muslims. So they, for people at home, these are basically Chinese Muslims. They have collected them and they've placed them into what have been deemed as re-education camps, which are in reality a mixture of labor camps,
Right.
um, prison camps, and sites where medical experimentation is being taken part upon these essentially captives that have been forced into there because of their religious beliefs. The Communist Party in China is virulently and atheist and anti-religious, whether it's Christian or Islam, but they
Or
have a specific
or
issue against Islam.
or Falun Gong that they define as a religion also.
Yes. In Falun Gong, I think Falun Gong has like Christian elements though.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it
But the
does.
Uyghurs are strictly Muslim.
Right.
Um, one of the reasons why I'm so anti-death penalty is because I think there's a real danger that if you give the wrong government or the wrong set of leaders the ability to kill people for perceived infractions against the law, you can get someone in the absolutist vein like the Edo who say like we have to do it this way, but not only the absolutist vein, but they manipulate that absolutist view to target specific individuals that would dissent against them.
Well, and the other important point is that
Just
we
like
talk.
Hitler, Hitler put political dissenters in those camps.
Oh,
You,
sure.
you listed a bunch of people there, but one group that I think that really gets left out are the political dissidents,
Though, but
especially
the
people
political
from like,
prisoners,
one movement that you and I admire very
the
much are
White
like
Rose.
the White Rose,
Yeah.
White Rose
Well,
Boys.
and the other thing we talk so much about evolution of the human species. How many countries still have the death penalty? Saudi
Less and less.
Arabia, China, the United States. Who else? I think there's only a handful.
There are 50. There are a total of 53 countries that still have a death sentence.
That's
Um,
out of about 200 some, right?
yes, out of 200 some.
Right.
How many
So
first world countries?
so the first world countries, there's not many. I think Japan might have it still, but it's very rarely used. Of course, we know the Philippines have it. That if Duterte gives you the police the order, you're gone.
Oh yeah. Oh well, we're not in good standing. Like most of the places that still have the death penalty are African countries with dictators and juntas.
Mm,
Which looking at Myanmar, we might have a junta there, and they might execute
mhm,
her, Aung San
mhm.
Suu Kyi. I'm sorry.
Right.
Um, but again, like this is an example of like, okay, it was very clear the January 6th coup that there were people among those rioters that were going to perform some sort of a death penalty on our elected officials.
Oh, I think that if they would have gotten their hands on Pelosi and Pence, they would have done them in.
Oh yeah, I think that yeah, but I think that there's another example of why like the impulse to respond to perceived infractions against a set of moral and ethical codes held in an absolute manner with mortal results. I think it really just leads to chaos. um one thing before we go, I wanted to talk about this idea of, where is it? Different countries and cultures really do have social mores, and it's kind of outside the laws themselves.
Hmm.
One thing that I think that we're facing, and it kind of goes back to our conversation during the previous episode. Um, I think one thing that the episode that we've highlighted that doesn't really deal with is the result of the Enterprise's interaction with the Edo down on um, Rubicon 3. One thing that one thing that makes me really concerned about the future is that we still have this kind of level of adherence to a higher authority of power instead of a sense of logic and reason. Because I think the real danger of the Edo isn't the fact that they live in this society where they adhere to this set of morals and customs that don't allow them to walk into certain spaces. I think the dangerous fact is that there are still civilizations out in the galaxy that are taking those customs from a central authority that gives no explanation to why it has that authority. And I think one thing that, Star Trek is a very American product in a way,
Yes.
in terms of, everyone makes the joke, especially in Star Wars fandoms, that like the Federation is space communism.
Hmm.
I don't think it's space communism. I think it's just space social democracy.
Hmm.
And I think one thing that we're facing, and I'll let you have the last word on this because the cat's screaming at me outside the door.
Hmm.
Um, we're coming to, and this gets into the conversation about Russia and China when it came to hacking. I think that we're coming to this place in the country and in the world where, like, we really do have to make the distinction between, are we going to lead and redevelop the world, especially post COVID, in a more humane way? Or is the way that things were going still applicable? Was the absolute certainty of the previous world between COVID still worthy of maintaining versus, the very real problems that we have going forward?
Oh, I can tell you the answer to this right now.
Yeah.
The answer is if you compare this pandemic to the 1918, 1920 pandemic, where, there's as many as 50 million or more people died from that terrible flu um,
Hmm.
100 years ago. We're over 2 million people that are documented to have lost their lives due to COVID-19. But one is, two things are different. We globally communicate. We
Hmm.
didn't have that global communication. We didn't really understand in a short time period what was going on around the world with that pandemic in 1918 to 1920. We do now.
Hmm.
And we're more educated in terms of global public health. And one of the things that is apparent is that you have this disparity in access to vaccines, not just in our country, but throughout the world, that less wealthy nations they don't have the financial resources to buy
Mhm.
the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine that are more expensive. The AstraZeneca might be less expensive. Just heard on the news today that Cuba might have its own vaccine.
Hmm.
Hungary was the first European country today to start to administer one of the Chinese vaccines. The point is that if we really want to open up the world to world travel and for the planet, for the species to get back to normal, we have to address this all together.
Mhm.
And it's not going to work that way because we don't know how to behave globally. And as a species, we're still different countries and different classes and all of that sort of thing. So there are lessons to be learned from how we get out of this pandemic that if we really are good scholars, we'll understand that we have to do things differently in the future. The other big thing is, Bill Gates was on 60 Minutes, and
I haven't seen that interview yet.
he is taking that there needs to be a humanity, the species has to deal with climate change,
Mhm.
and
Oh,
that's
absolutely.
even bigger than dealing with the pandemic. So the message that Bill Gates and
Well,
climate
climate change
scientists.
is the cause of the next pandemic. The next big pandemic will likely be the result of climate change. We are
Oh,
heating up this planet, and we are causing many places to become petri dishes for all
oh
sorts
well,
of disease and viruses.
you're gonna see just in the U.S. you'll see mosquito-borne diseases that have
Yeah.
only been in the tropics move into Georgia and the Carolinas and the Virginia, and we'll have more Zika and Q fever and chikungunya virus and things like that. And I mean, they've already talked about that the mRNA viruses are so good that might provide the opportunity to create vaccines for them. But it's like, wait a minute, that sounds good, but the real problem is why are these diseases that only exist in the tropics going to be something that exists in the mid-Atlantic of the United States or in Missouri and so forth? It's like this isn't good. This is not where we want to go.
Yeah, we shouldn't have to have a need to develop a new cure in the first place, because we
Correct.
should want to have a disease to show up on the world
Right.
stage to begin with.
Right.
That's a really insidious way that capitalism has worked itself into medicine, and it's a thing that we really don't talk about.
Right.
But you know what? Hopefully, I think Picard shows us this, and this episode shows us this, is that maybe we do have the ability to progress, that there is a way to progress, and maybe, as we keep going through this series, they'll keep discussing it.
Right.
Dad, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Where No Bubs Has
Okay.
Gone Before. Uh, I think we both enjoyed season 1, episode 8, Justice.
It had a lot in it.
Yeah, it certainly did. We will be back next time for
The battle.
actually, yes, the battle, Star Trek Next Generation season 1, episode 9, which is one of the first Stargazer episodes. So I'm actually really
Yes.
excited. I love the battle. But we will see you next time. Dad, thank you for joining us, and
Okay.
we'll talk soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.